really good for a team. So hopefully they can stay composed like that. But it looks like we are into the picks and bans here for game number 1 of semi-final number 1 for the FACEIT Challenger Invitational.
Okay, let's see if some of those banned champions that we predicted come out here stress. And just say perhaps Kha'Zix, because we know Amin picks that up, a couple of the mid laners as well. We know Kasten is going to be banned out at some point. LeBlanc is going to be the first banned champion.
Yeah, LeBlanc is a champion we've seen coming into the meta to answer picks like Gragas. We saw it actually backfire a number of times yesterday. I believe Gragas came out ahead on against LeBlanc. I think that was in the Cloud9 games where it was Forbiven playing LeBlanc. And it just seems to not be 100% of a safe lane for LeBlanc. There is ways of her dying pretty early in that matchup. If you take too many barrels and don't land enough harass, Gragas becomes pretty strong at level 6.
We actually saw every single matchup that LeBlanc had being good on paper.
Yeah.
Like, you would be like, okay, that LeBlanc's going to win that lane, and every single time it was the Gragas coming out on top. But the following couple bans will be fresh, which makes sense against either of these support players. We know Miffy can play a fantastic fresh along with Libic. So just take that off the board. We'll just restrain some of those bot laners. Most likely we'll see something like an Annie. Lasta also gets thrown down.
Okay, so at this point in the game, I have to think that MYM want to pick Gragas first. With Zed and LeBlanc banned, those are the two biggest counters that we saw yesterday, and it'll force NIP onto a default champion, something like an Orianna, which doesn't quite have the same potency that Nuke Duck would like. Other options are Fizz that are in his playstyle, but a Riven ban as well. I really feel like this has to be a Gragas here.
Yeah, these picks are all centered towards the mid lane. We do see some top lane Zed, some top lane Riven, but it's most likely mid lane champions, and that's a huge focus. Making sure that they can just make sure their mid lane is the lane they get rolling is something we don't often see. Sometimes they do spread out their bans, but in fact Yashua and indeed Kasten are also focused at the mid lane. We saw Yashua topping yesterday, didn't actually do too much, but the Yashua, of course, are going to be banned out against Chuyu.
And this is MYM saying that we don't actually fear Armin in the jungle. I mean, I was expecting quite a few bans towards the jungle because typically that's what teams will do. And with Elise still open, they don't pick up Gragas as a first pick. So they've left it open to the second rotation. And I feel like this could end up perhaps backfiring on MYM.
This is not the type of champion that Amin necessarily picks up either.
Yeah. It's
not like they're taking away Elise from Amin's champion pool. He can quite happily go for something like Kha'Zix here. And with Leap, some jungle players like to max the Leap second. And especially in a Elise matchup, you can just wipe out the Spiderlings, then get the isolation damage. But before that, of course, she does have those Spiderlings, which makes it a little more difficult to try and instantly assassinate that champion. But there's a lot available to Amin right here. There's the Lee Sin, of course, which most junglers will play at this level. But Kha'Zix is something we've seen him so comfortable on. It's going to be the bot lane pickup first. That's going to be Jinx and Annie.
There is the Gragas locked in for Chuyu. So they were looking to pick it up.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of fortunate for MYM that NIP didn't prioritize it. But knowing Nuke Duck, I mean, that's not the kind of champion he'd like to first pick. He would prefer to have the counter pick. And while on red side, I think it's smart to hold that as an option for them. Zyra has been picked up alongside that Gragas, so we'll see where the AD carry lies down in that bottom lane to go against the Annie Jinx lane. Annie Jinx, high burst in that lane, a lot of crowd control. You land the stun, you chain it into the flame chompers, and there's just a lot of control in that bottom lane.
Right, and I mean, Zyra isn't a pick we see every single game either, Stress. I mean, most likely it's those big supports like Annie, like Leona as well, and Fresh. But Zyra has been coming back into it. She makes perfect sense. She's still strong. She received a couple of nerfs in terms of supports. The early game damage was nerfed as we headed into Season 4, and her scaling slightly increased. So moving that more towards a mage pick. But it doesn't matter. Her plants still hurt quite a lot in the early game.
Lee Sin has been locked in alongside Kayle. Kayle, I think, is a champion that kind of slipped through the bans phase here for mid laners. The Kayle Gragas matchup is almost a race to 6, because if Kayle hits 6 before Gragas hits 6 and has intervention available, and you can predict the movement for that explosive cask, you can actually survive through it. But it's one of the matchups that Kayle will get stronger and stronger throughout the game, provided you get the itemization. Gragas will always be relevant, but Kayle will as well.
Yeah.
Because of the utilities of both ultimates, both champions will very rarely find themselves in a place where they can't do anything.
Definitely a lane that can go either way. So the next couple of pickups are going to be that Lucian and also Renekton, which is a pretty solid top laner if you don't know what you're going to be up against. I mean, they haven't really given anything away. The Lee Sin has been picked up, most likely going to be on Amin. You don't really see Lee Sin top lane or mid lane anymore.
I mean, a Renekton lock in here opens Dr. Mundo and Shyvana. I would expect a Mundo more than a Shyvana here. and it looks like they are hovering over it. Shyvana did get hit a little bit in the recent patch nerfs, so her damage is a little bit lower. Mundo, on the other hand, unchanged, so still pretty handy in that top lane.
Right.
So Mundo against Renekton is a little bit easier of a lane. Renekton struggles somewhat in the early game against Mundo until he can start getting a little bit more resistance and has a little bit more sustain from his abilities. And it's not too surprising to see these two after the drop-off of Shyvana. Renekton's picked quite a lot to offset a lot of the Trundle pickups, which have been coming back into the meta, or have been coming into the meta, because Trundle's not found himself a lot in the meta until recently.
Absolutely. So now we have the full alliance from both of these teams, and what are they really looking for? So I'm looking for like immediate synergies from these team compositions. We've had a lot of back and forth from kind of counter picks and what's been available for them, and there's no doubt all these picks are strong, but what are we looking for in terms of synergy?
I mean, right here, there's a lot of single target on the side of... I was about to say single target on the side of NIP, and then I remembered they got Annie there, so there's not a single target at all.
Yeah.
The Lee Sin engage will be single target, but the Flash Tibbers engage will be good at locking people down. And then you look from that for picks, you look to Lee Sin, you look to Kayle, they'll have the single target slows. And that is just a good way of catching up with anybody that seems to be offset from the team fight. So there's a lot of crowd control on the side of NIP, but a lot of disruption and a lot of fight potential on the side of MYM. They have good disengage from Zyra and Gragas.
I feel like these teams are very evenly matched in pretty much all stages of the game. I mean, the bot lane is going to be two guys who can just trade up against each other. If one gets ahead, then they're most likely going to stay ahead, but there's always a chance to come back into it. These aren't lanes that necessarily have either like counters as well. We spoke about the mid lane, Gragas and Kayle. Kayle can quite easily kill Gragas, while Gragas can do the exact same thing, baiting out the intervention. Top lane is going to be more of like a slower lane. I mean, Renekton and Mundo is never usually going to go anywhere.
I mean, to go back a little bit to that Gragas and Kayle matchup, we actually saw that in the Scan Invitational that Ocelot was playing in the Gragas-Kayle matchup against Cloud9, so it was forbidden against Ocelot, and Ocelot, I believe, just got deleted by a massive explosive cask after intervention wasn't available. So that matchup and the ability to control team fights and land damage is heavily reliant on the cooldown of intervention. Yeah. If intervention is available, you can predict the explosive cast, which is a pretty fast cast animation, but isn't impossible. Reactionary plays are a little bit tricky at times, but I would expect if you're picking up a champion like Kayle that you're pretty quick on ulting yourself or another teammate. So it's all down to that ultimate cooldown.
But that is the problem with picking Kayle into Gragas, specifically in team fights, because Gragas will hit more than one person, but intervention is only a single target, so you're not going to be able to defend against all of it, you're only going to be able to save one person. So in the laning phase, that will suit Kayle perfectly fine, because she'll just ult herself. But when it comes to team fights, she may be taken down while she saves an ally.
Yeah, I mean, in the early game, both of them are pretty much melee champions. Righteous Fury, while active, of course, will make Kayle ranged, but there's quite a significant cooldown at the earliest levels of Righteous Fury, where you both will be farming in melee range. And the body slam changes to Gragas that happened a good few patches ago, then made sure that now Gragas does more damage on the body slam to multiple targets, whereas you used to get more damage on a single target. It's now even, regardless of whether you hit one target or multiple targets. Right. So it means that if Kayle comes in towards Gragas and Gragas has body slam available, they'll trade a body slam for the Q from Kayle. So they will trade damage, but it just means that there's going to be a couple of early trades in that lane as both come forward to land some auto attacks on minions.
Right, so it'll probably even each other out. Yeah. I think those champions can trade against each other very effectively in the early game up until level 6. So taking a look at the junglers, Ammon on a very comfortable champion of Lee Sin, facing down Elise. Now in the jungle, they can kind of go head-to-head fairly easily. Elise is probably going to come slightly ahead in that trade. And then when it comes to ganks as well, they're most likely going to find each other, but they won't completely take out the other person outright. For example, if one was running Vi and the other person was running any other viable jungler at the moment, then it should be taken down in that trade.
Yeah, that's something that both of these champions are pretty happy to do, is trade in the jungle. They're pretty confident. They're also very maneuverable around the jungle as well. Good at escaping situations. You have to repel from Elise and also, safeguard out from Lee Sin. And you can see the game is in the loading screen on the Jumbotron behind us. I know it's not that jumbo, but...
Well, that's what we've dubbed it.
It's a pretty big screen behind us. And I love the studio here, the FACEIT Studios, which, if you guys don't realize, we are in Milan, Italy here for the FACEIT Challenger Invitational. So... Yeah. pretty nice out. We didn't bring the weather today. It's got a little bit brighter outside.
It's a bit chilly.
It's a bit chilly, but you know, it wouldn't
better.
be European weather for the most part without being a little cold in February.
We're underground right now, so we wouldn't even know if it hit us. We're going to be in the studio all day, which is absolutely fantastic. Nice and warm.
It is nice and warm in here, as you said. Bit chilly outside, but thankfully it's not raining today. After yesterday, it seemed to downpour. We brought the floods from the UK to the streets.
We haven't bought the gale force winds yet.
Luckily. I mean, the plane I took over here was pretty small, so I hope the gale force winds don't come back.
It just ends up in a different country.
Yeah, I'll it's okay. It maybe if it blows me towards Germany, then, you know, I could just go and visit LCS for a week. But who knows? It's one of those things. The weather's unpredictable, as are these teams, because it's NIP versus MYM. We're heading into game number 1 of this best of 3 in our semi-finals for the FACEIT Challenger Invitational.
And we are onto the rift and onto a pause.
Oh,
as always.
It wouldn't be a game of League of Legends without an instant pause.
Of course.
As you head into the game. I believe MYM are just having a couple of connection issues, so we'll stay on us for a little while. You can see in the background as soon as we start
what happens when we go back into the game. Yeah. So a couple of these guys have picked up items. I mean, only one person was quick on the trigger there with Freeze picking up his Duran's blade, but I don't expect to see anything really out of the ordinary. Supports like to pick up those Duran shields or a gold item, but more than likely they'll pick up Duran shield for that early trading. And most lanes are now picking up Duran shield because it turns out to be a very good item.
Yeah, it's pretty good in the bottom lane because of the amount that bottom lanes now want to trade. And the jungler presence as well. It gives that extra survivability, the extra regen, and is one of the routes that there's a couple of different schools of thought in support. I think Crepo is one of the schools of support that says, I don't really need the gold per 5 item because my Sightstone acts as gold per 5. It doesn't mean he doesn't build gold per 5 every game, but as long as he doesn't have to buy wards and has Sightstone instead, that's going to make him pretty tanky with the Doran Shield, the Ruby Crystal as well, and also save some gold from not having to buy wards. We are headed into the game here for game number 1. Let's head on to the Summoner's Rift.
And we'll see exactly what these supports pick up. So it's going to be Duran shields all around. No one going to go for a Targon's Brace or indeed the Ancient Coin just yet. I mean, most players will build a Ancient Coin at some point for the extra movement speed when you upgrade it into the Talisman of Ascension, which is extremely good when you don't have a Karma on your team, or even indeed a Sivir, which is one of the reasons those 2 champions are picked up in the bottom lane. But going to see everyone fan out, no early aggression just yet.
Yeah, so typically on supports, Targon's Brace would be picked up on a champion like Leona. Relic Shield would be picked up on a champion like Leona and then made into Targon's Brace because of the melee range. You get that added gold from it. Typically, the 2 options for range support, such as Zyra and Annie, are the Doran Shield or the Ancient Coin, as you were alluding to, for that extra movement speed boost, because you don't get that extra gold from the Relic Shield. So I think with the current meta, Doran Shield is the best start right now in this current matchup, where you are going to have a lot of jungler presence in that bottom lane.
So we're going to see both of these junglers starting up in the top jungle. So Lee Sin will find himself in the bottom half, while Lee's will do exactly the same thing. And you were just mentioning that the bottom lane is a place where we see most of the action nowadays. Because in the mid lane, we're seeing very hyper-maneuverable champions, such as Gragas, with nothing really going to happen there as soon as he gets body slam. And then KO as well is slightly less maneuverable. Maybe that's going to be a second gank for Amin. But bot lane is usually where the action's at.
Yeah, because top lane is pretty stagnant as a lane. It's top lane. I know it's not exactly the most exciting way of saying it, but top laners like to farm a lot and become very tanky. And there's not a lot of ways you can really shove out a top laner without trading so heavily that you go even. It's only when you have an item difference, and there's a bit of an exchange in the bottom lane there. Freeze took a little bit of damage, but nothing too significant to start this game off.
And top laners don't necessarily have burst either, so you can gradually see your health decay, and it's like, oh, well, I'm on 10%, and I can probably stay in for a couple more auto attacks because they don't have significant burst. Renekton kind of flies against that just a little bit in the early game, but against Mundo, that kind of, again, cancels it out. Yeah,
we saw that yesterday in the games between SK and Triple LOL, where JWoww went for an aggressive top laner. There's been a catch in the bottom lane, but a little bit out of the range. An aggressive top laner with damage just ended up being ground down by a tank top laner that is the current meta. So it's not too surprising that you face tank with tank. In this middle lane, NukeDuck has hit level 2. This is what you kind of expect when Righteous Fury is active from Kayle, is it's heavily shoving in towards the Gragas and ends up trying to force Gragas off farm fairly early on. You can see it's 9 CS to 5. This is a very early game, so you know it's not too surprising that there is that little bit of a disparity between the two. But as Kayle goes further on into the game, gets the extra cooldown reduction, she's going to be able to use Righteous Fury far more often and have the time that it's on cooldown far lower. So you're able to shove pretty effectively into a Gragas.
As you can see, we have gone back into another pause. I believe there are some connection issues or problems with some of these guys. We are not at a live event, so these guys are going to be playing from home, and there's all going to be all sorts of issues that admins can't sort out for them.
Yeah, in this, there's a couple of matchups in this game that just are a little bit finicky for the very early game. We're heading back into it. You can see there's a bit of a CS difference from the early trades, but they'll tend to even out in all of the lanes as this game goes further and further on. And it's really going to come down to jungler presence to really dictate who's going to end up picking it up. You would expect all of these lanes to trade even if left to themselves.
Absolutely. So these junglers are going to have the impact on these lanes, and we'll see exactly what happens. Lee Sin getting around to about half of the map, which is exactly what we predicted. Elise actually started up with the red buff, so going to be finding itself at the top lane. Might be able to do something. Repel is a great tool. We're going for that early tower dive against Zara Zero, who's going to be on that Mundo. Past first couple of levels, Mundo's not going to be tower diveable.
It's just a difference in jungler pathing here, and it means that down in this bottom lane, Armin is going to be able to head down there or even rotate around perhaps to an out-of-position Gragas, but also gives him access to the lower jungle here. Looks like he's going to come mid for the first gank, and both junglers will be centering themselves around this middle lane. Let's see if they can actually find their way in.
Elise was hanging around, not so much for the gank, but potentially for the counter gank. Chuyu's going to go backwards, and Armin's going to interrupt him with the Sonic Wave into Resonating Strike. It's not going to be enough to take him down, but it's going to be enough to at least push him back. Yeah,
without an all-in from Kayle and Lee Sin, it's pretty difficult to gank Gragas this early into the game. Has Body Slam available. You saw Amin take some damage from it as well, but Chuyu with the Happy Hour as well is going to be able to sustain himself pretty well back into this game.
And likewise, so can Kayle with her own heal, so not too much is going to happen over time. As long as these guys just hit each other once in a while, then they'll sustain it back up. So, bottom lane. These guys are kind of rooting down the Ezreal. I think that's Ezreal. Yeah, that's definitely Ezreal. No, it's not Ezreal.
There's no Ezreal in this game.
There's no Ezreal. I was looking at the kind of blonde hair, and I was like, that's Ezreal. No, that's the skin of Annie.
I would say it's early in the day, but unfortunately it's not. I don't think Ezreal quite looks that feminine to be
well, some people would claim otherwise.
It's Annie in this game.
Tarek,
it's okay.
Tarek
it's the first game of the day, and I think we're all just a little bit giddy at the fact that it's two former LCS teams. But you can see MYM shoving pretty hard into this bottom lane. That's quite typical of a Zyra lane. The plants and also the grasping roots will push the lane pretty quickly in towards the tower. Lucian has not the best auto attack range, but it looks like Armin forced to safeguard out in the middle lane. Yeah, Lucian, not the absolute best champion at pushing, but still pretty competent at that role himself.
They're just going to shove it up to the tower. They're not really fearing the Lee Sin, especially when Elise is hanging around in the bottom jungle, so they can just push up the tower, deny some of that CS, and that's not really going to be such a big deal in the end. But Freeze is going to find it a little bit more difficult to farm onto the tower in the early game.
And this Zyra Annie is really going to end up being dictated at level 6 because Mithy's going to look to flash Tibbers in, and Zyra's going to use the Stranglethorns to try and disengage as much as possible. It's all down to the timing of which hits first, because if the stun lands and they're able to close the distance, then Stranglethorns will only do so much to disengage. They'll get the knockup, but it depends on how much damage has already landed by that point and whether the Super Mega Death Rocket can pick up a kill.
Doesn't matter if the Stranglethorns lands if they're already dead, which is very possible against the lane when you're in an Annie and Jinx who can throw down the execute on the only carry with a % damage execute, which can result in quite a lot on top of the Tibbers. Annie is one of the burstiest supports, which sometimes can pick up Deathfire Grasp. We've seen some more damage-orientated builds from Annie players, but may not see that this game.
I mean, Libic is clearly confident in this matchup because he picked Zyra after Annie was locked in. So it tells me that he is pretty confident that they can avoid any kind of all-in engage from Mithy.
Yeah, it's just going to be a little bit annoying early game as they poke them down, but they're not actually doing too badly in CS. In fact, the CS is basically equal, and it will equalize just in a couple seconds while it gets pushed back to their turret. That's going to be a beautiful grasping root who lands on to do. Macklin's going to be jumping forwards with Flash. The Flame Jumpers goes down. Ignite is taking on to Freeze. Barrier was also used, and I think he should be good. Yeah, would have needed another 2 ticks of Ignite.
Yeah, Freeze just getting out of that one alive, but forced to use both summoners from that. That means MYM are going to be able to shove this into the tower and get a good amount of experience and gold here over the lead. But as you're expecting, all of the lanes are pretty much tying fairly even right now. Only that little engagement in the bottom lane is going to force a separation. MYM will recall on a ward, and a lot of that difference will be offset as Jinx heads back into the lane.
Going to be slightly ahead, but Annie's going to be soaking up that XP regardless, so it doesn't really matter. Plus, having the Annie slightly ahead of the AD carry is not a bad thing. It means she hits Tibbers first, and almost means that they can't engage onto the Jinx if that Tibbers is available. An instant stun and instant extra damage is something you don't want to have to try and deal with, especially when Lee Sin could be lurking around the corner. In fact, talking about Lee Sin, we haven't really seen his effect, or indeed Elise's effect on this game just yet.
I think with two early game junglers that have clearly picked the same jungle paths, routing for their ganks, it's pretty difficult for either to separate themselves without one of them making a mistake. And both junglers are fairly consistent here and really just aren't running into trades. We saw Armin escaping with Safeguard. You know, Elise has the same maneuverability, and they're both going to find themselves around this middle lane at the same time. Mid laners are going to head towards the blue buffs fairly shortly. And, you know, there's not going to be a lot of action here in the jungle as both mid laners head out.
Definitely cancelling each other out in the mid lane. They have picked up their first couple items, which is going to be the double Duran's rings, which is, again, fairly common for those mid laners as they head into their own respective builds. Kaele's a little bit different. Doesn't usually go for the classic Fiends and Holy Grail to the Death Cap, which we so often see on many of those mid laners. Most likely going to go for a Stinger into the Nash's Tooth.
Yeah, it looked like Armin just walked over a ward, was looking to safeguard over to Tribush, but with it warded up from MYM, that will nullify any effect that he was going to have in that lane there. And that was actually purchased wards as well. It wasn't the trinket wards. You can see they have not been used out by MYM. So good early warding from MYM to really stop the ganks. He's going to walk over another one, so they should be able to disengage this.
Doesn't seem like NIP are giving up for a dragon anytime soon either, because 0-0 used to teleport to get up back to top lane, so that's going to be on cooldown for another 5 minutes or so.
One thing that NIP have to be careful of was we saw yesterday, Elise can solo dragon. You switch around the aggro onto the spiderlings and deal a lot of percentage damage, so they've got to be careful that Makata doesn't disappear from the map for too long and ends up just taking dragon away.
Well, Lee Sin is still hanging around the bot jungle, so he might be able to stop that if they decide to go for it. But there's no ward over it currently, and very little vision from the team of Ninjas in Pyjamas in general. But because this has been a passive start, they haven't necessarily needed. But as you said, when you get to around 10 minutes and Elise starts getting a couple levels under her belt, there's the Gragas barrel. Just kind of pushing Nuketook back. I mean, most of these guys are just using their ultimates because they know they're not going to get a kill, but at least they can do a little more damage to their lane. Yeah,
Nuketook just takes the barrel. Chuyu's trying to set this up for a gank, but Elise isn't aware that she walked over a ward at her red buff, so Armin has already positioned himself around this lane. They've pinged onto him. I believe he may have just clipped that dragon ward, but it's just that he's been spotted. There's no way that either jungler really is going to have an effect on this game, and both teams here are really kind of cautious in the early going. Neither wants to dive in, and it's a very different team to what we saw from MYM in their first game of yesterday.
Well, definitely makes sense. These guys have history. They know each other. They know how they play. And often when these guys know how strong the opponent is, they just throw out the respect and say, well, we're going to play it a little more passive. We don't want to go for an aggressive team composition that may not necessarily work against you, because if we lose the early game, then we know it's only ever going to get worse.
So, a little bit of a departure in, standard builds for top lane of what you'd expect. It's definitely standard on Renekton to build a TM at first. You get the extra regen. You also get the ability to animation cancel your stun. But it's not the Sunfire Cape that a lot of top laners will build in an AD versus AD matchup. It means that he's going to deal a little bit more damage to Mundo, but will also take more in response. And he's just got to be a bit careful as Mundo gets Sadism available, that Dominus and Sadism get used at the same time. He'll survive that lane and regen up from a lot of the minion damage, but MYM will rotate out towards the dragon. They've already been spotted on that ward. Mithy has to back off, though, because MYM come back into the lane.
Elise is hanging around. Makata is actually just sitting straight on top of a ward. Has he picked up the sweeping lens? That's going to be a no, so doesn't actually realize that he is spotted out. However, lane from NIP is too pushed up to the tower, so not going to quite happen. Kuban is going to be taking some cleavers, but doesn't feel all that threatened as that tier man has been picked up. He's quite happy to sustain through that lane.
And one difference here in the support builds, as we see a lot of action headed around that bottom lane, is you can see Annie's already finished that Sightstone, and as soon as you've done that, swaps out for the Sweeper Trinket, so is able to clear out wards earlier into the game. But mid lane, there's a gang.
Dragon's Rage comes down. Chu's going to follow up with the body slam. There's the ultimate off cooldown. Cocoon comes across, lands onto Ammon. Makana's going to try and turn this one around onto NIP, and Chuyu escapes with his life.
Amin and Mokata are reading each other exceptionally well here. MYM have used more wards to make sure they stay on top of Amin, but it just looks like the wards from NIP have just been good enough to read Mokata around the map. They've only had a couple out in this entire game, but both junglers are pretty much identically pathed right now.
Every time we see one jungler there, it's going to be followed up by a counter gank or nothing happens, and lots of ultimates have been used, but no one's really dropped below half health yet, I don't think.
No, it only Chuyu in that engagement managed to get away with his life as well. So it's a very close game here in the early going, and MYM are going to be a little in trouble in the top lane. But again, Kubon's very tanky.
Well, he's going to take a couple of hits. He's built the Tiamat, so he's a little more squishy than he might usually be against that AD top lane. But Aman doesn't, really want to go for that. That's going to be MYM rotating, picking up Dragon while Lee Sin was at top lane. So Kubon takes a couple of hits and going to take the Dragon in return.
Yeah, Kubon had started moving down to the mid lane. Takes a lot of damage from Nuke Duck, actually. Chuyu finds his way into the lane, but Kubon will back off.
Kubon's low enough where he's going to have to recall, so Mundo might get a small CS advantage while he just gets back into lane. And indeed, has already had that CS advantage for a little while. It's going to be just about 2 creep waves. Dragon gone down is going to even that up, though, for the team of MeetYourMakers. And Ninjas in Pyjamas are quite content to carry on farming. So already, that's going to accelerate the builds as we head into mid-game, because there hasn't been too much action, and everyone's basically got perfect CS.
Yeah, and looking at the bottom laners for their builds, you can see Jinx is going for the pretty standard in all games, Bloodthirster here with a BF Sword, Vampiric Scepter first, but over on the side of Lucian, building Trinity Force items first, which is doable on Lucian, is fairly standard as well, but the difference that will give is reduce the damage that the culling will do, but actually increase the potential to trade. It'll give the extra movement speed when landing attacks. It'll give extra damage from Sheen when using the auto attacks after casting an ability. So it just changes where Lucian's damage is in his kit in the early game. Once he gets both, it'll be fairly standard. Again, top laners, both with the ultimates available, neither are going to die there.
I mean, Kubon gets pushed back to his tower, and I always called him Cubone, which is something entirely different, but I wonder if it's maybe came from the same thing. Makler, of course, with that build we just mentioned, Sheen into the Phage, and he's also picked up the Berserker's Greaves, which is not something we typically see from any lane. They don't upgrade their boots so early, maybe mid lane a little bit more with the Sork boots, but definitely bot laners will not typically upgrade their boots to the tier 2 quite so early. But since he's going for the Trinity Force, and his damage is going to be coming from the auto attacks and not the culling, where attack speed actually still makes some sense. I mean, it does increase the damage. I
think it's actually more for the movement speed here rather than the attack speed. Obviously, both will benefit him, but the way that MYM are playing this lane is they're shoving in hard to NIP and not letting Mithy get into a position to flash Tibbers. So they're actually backing off, and it helps their disengage in this bottom lane. Stranglethorns will go down. They'll be able to move further away with that added movement speed.
Right. Amen. Finds himself a pink ward. That's going to be plus 30 gold to him, and do they have a pink ward to place back down? That's going to be a no, but at least they can place down a normal ward. Neither of these junglers, again, able to do anything. Had to walk up to the top lane on 8 legs and wasn't quite able to find Zoro Zero, as he had quite backed off to his golems and actually walked back into lane. So maybe if Makata had hung around for another couple seconds, might have seen him just turn up. But Recton, he's feeling quite good right now. He's just going to carry on farming behind the turret.
And now we're into one of these games which is pretty slow. Will Armin make the first move?
Oh, there's the Dragon's Rage and the standard execute combo. The ultimate from Chuyu will knock both of his aggressors. Jump over the wall and the follow-up. That's first blood to Armin.
Really nice time there by Armin. Waited to land the Q until Gragas tried to get over the wall, and it followed him over. Managed to catch up with the resonating strike. Picks up the kill.
A little bit easier to do it on Lee Sin over someone like Vi, who has to preempt that, but Lee Sin can just land the Q, stand there, laugh at you, wait for a couple seconds, then you jump over the wall and he just clicks Q again and he's good to go. Both of these top laners quite content just to carry on farming behind the turrets. Because they are so farm. Mundo with 172 has been taken some of those creeps. Libbit gets stunned up. Tibbers comes down. Super Mega Death Rocket will completely whiff, and that will signal the end of that engage.
Yeah, and you have to feel that will favor MYM. They didn't have to disengage from that fight with anything other than movement. There was just no real way of NIP picking up kills there, and That means MYM are going to be safe now for the next gank or even engage attempt for themselves here, as all of their disengage tools will be available. I believe Dragon is due up in a couple of minutes' time as well, so they have some important ultimates that will be available. Yeah, 2 minutes on the Dragon timer. NIP's ultimates will be available as well, but it just means that any fights in the meantime, MYM are going to have the advantage.
And usually teams will look for a pick before a Dragon happens, and at that point they won't have those ultimates and might be taken down. We said before that NIP, well, in the first Dragon didn't have the vision, but this time around have placed down the pink ward, so they'll be able to take down any of those wards that just had to be placed down by MYM, or if they wander past the area, then at least even if the ward is taken out, they'll know that they're going to attempt that Dragon, which the information they didn't have the first time. Makata comes into the bot lane trying to deal as much damage as he can, take down this turret and remove that safe haven, but Lee Sin is coming for the, I would say counter gank, but I guess more of a counter push.
Well, Chuyu had roamed as well, so they were actually looking for the 4v3 there to pick up as many picks as they could and then disengage from that fight, because it's close enough to Dragon that you can really just get the ward vision and just control the Dragon area to do it before they can even get back. And Armin would have been in a little bit of trouble there if they'd managed to engage on them, but MYM don't manage to find it.
Both these junglers just hanging around at the bot lane, knowing that not anything is going to happen in the mid and top, and are just trying their best to siege this tower in. They have that small advantage in terms of tower health, so they're going to try and just bring it on out. That's down to about 60% HP, but it's going to take a long time to eventually make that into rubble.
KL is nearly at a point where Righteous Fury will be active the whole time. Fiendish Codex has been picked up, which will give extra cooldown reduction, but along with blue buff, you'll just be able to stay in ranged form for so much longer. I think, if I remember rightly, it's below 3/4 of a second that the actual cooldown is that will be on Righteous Fury, which, when you look at attack speed, that's about one attack's worth.
Yeah. So, top lane, that was actually Mundo picking out up. Intervention comes down, doesn't quite mitigate the damage and still gets knocked into Chuyu. He doesn't quite have the damage to finish him off. There's the Dragon's range. The Q lands. Tempest into the cripple, but Nukeduck is going dangerously low. Amin is keeping up those auto attacks. Does not have the red buff. Mokata comes in for the counter gank. Lands the cocoon as well. Forces the flash out towards the turret. Livic had rotated from bot lane. Makler is going to find himself Miffy, and Miffy's got to be very careful. Actually just walks straight past him, and MYM choose not to cut him off, but instead to take down the mid turret.
Yeah, and they'll be able to rotate down towards Dragon and secure the area. I don't think they can do it without forcing a fight here, but it will give them the position. They'd already rotated Kuban down. They are going to go for it. The teleport has come in behind them by Zoro0. They have to burst this one down quickly or they risk a fight.
Yeah, well, the Dragons are already dead. Miffy flashes over the Stranglefords. A huge Tibbers onto 3 members. Zoro0 flashes into the fight. Amin comes in from nowhere. Lands the Q onto Makler. Zoro0 is still chunking down Kuban. The Culling comes in from behind as they retreat into their safety of that turret. Tibbers is still alive and is just hanging around. Kuban will be the first to drop the first casualty. Freeze gets knocked back into that bush, and Makler is thrown into the red zone. We'll see if any more kills go down, but still, this is a very scattered team fight. Makala is heading back into his own jungle. Miffy is going to try and get this done. Lands it. Amin follows up the Sonic Wave into the Resonating Strike, and Makato's only gone into a worse position. The Repel comes up, but there's nowhere really to go. The Flame Choppers comes down. And, well, Makata's still in that pit and will be eventually taken out by Nukeduck. They knew he wasn't going to go anywhere.
Everywhere Makata went, there was another member of NIP to cut him off. I think MYM will somewhat be happy taking Dragon in exchange for 2. The problem is they also lost red buff there, and if they lose mid turret here, they'll even up the turret that was taken from them earlier. And it's just one of those things that was a fairly even trade between these two teams, and the goal is, to quote Joe Miller, bang even.
They're going to take away the blue buff as well, so going to completely choke MeetYourMakers away from their own small buffs. Nukeduck trying his best to take down the bot turret. May even happen. Libix is the only one to stop this push from happening. Has only just taken down the cannon creep. That's going to even up the turrets in different lanes, and there's no dragon, so it doesn't matter too much, but it's 1-to-1 on turrets.
Yeah, you can see how long Kale stayed in Righteous Fury there for, and as soon as Kale picks up a Lich Bane as well, which typically is the 2nd or 3rd item on Kale. Yesterday we saw Rabadon's before Lich Bane. It's also fairly typical to go Lich Bane before Rabadon's. As soon as you get that Lich Bane, that tower pushing is even more deadly out of Kayle. You'll push down turrets so fast. All you got to do is throw a heal in every so often, get that Lich Bane proc, and you'll chunk through towers.
And that's sometimes what we see NukeDuck doing, or indeed the Kayle.
Something very different in this game. Lucian has gone Trinity Force into Bilgewater Cutlass.
Interesting.
For Blade of the Ruined King. I remember somebody doing this once, and I think it was in an LCS game. This is really testing my memory, because I've only ever seen it once. And I personally feel like it reduces a lot of the damage that Lucian does, because you don't get added damage onto the culling, which heading into the later team fights is a significant part of Lucian's damage. Once you have Bloodthirster, Last Whisper, Trinity Force, the culling will do so much damage provided you can hit your target that I don't know about getting the percentage damage on your auto attacks when the culling is a significant part of the damage.
I'd have to wonder about the maths on that, with how much damage it would actually do, because it gives you attack speed as well, and that also influences the damage from the culling. I'm not sure if that will offset the extra AD you get from the Bloodthirster. NukeDuck's going to throw down the Reckoning into the auto attack from Makala, and it's already quite a lot of damage. And he is only on one item, picked up the Sheen as well.
I feel like with a Jinx that's seemingly building, as we see, a trade in the bottom lane, this seems to be the point where NukeDuck feels he can win this.
Yeah, he's definitely won the fight and forces the flash from Chuyu, who's going to go ahead and recall. I love that. I love that animation.
Always catches me off guard. NukeDuck's actually just going to keep putting the pressure on here. Has to be careful he doesn't take too much damage, but I feel like this matchup on AD carries, Jinx is going to be doing so much more damage. You look at the Bloodthirster Last Whisper, she's going to shred through Renekton and Elise even at this point in the game, and I don't know whether the damage out of Lucian is going to be enough to offset that. It's something that we'll have to see, because this is a very non-standard build here for Lucian.
You have the Light Slinger passive, so you're going to get that proc on each of those auto attacks, because you have like a mini auto attack as well after that. But again, it's an interesting build. We'll have to see exactly what happens. It's more of a chase down build as well, because you get the extra movement speed and slow someone down, and Lucian does excel in those scenarios with Relentless Pursuit and the culling. So we'll just have to see. It's maybe the type of playstyle that they're going for as well. They're not going for maybe the straight-on team fight. They've got the Zyra, obviously, for the disengage, and maybe they want to go for the smaller fights in the jungle and the small skirmishes. That might be what they're shooting for.
Also, I wonder whether it helps his scaling against a champion like Jinx. It remains to be seen. It's something that I don't think has been seen enough. So, you know, the jury's out on this one. I don't want to say that it's too one way or the other. It's something that I think I'll just let the build speak for itself for a while.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see exactly how well it does in the rest of this game, so there's no point calling it. And Amin heads around the side. He's going to find himself Livik. Let's see if he can land the grasping roots. He's going to do that. Makler comes in from the side, and that's the extra damage from the Cutlass. Now, Miffy flashing up red. Just probably took a barrow on the mid lane.
Yeah, you've got to be careful you don't take too much poke here from Gragas, but I think all across the board you can see just how even these teams are. Only really the top lane has that separation, and that's because as Mundo goes out the game, he's able to just keep burning Agony on and sit in minion waves, and just Kubon can't do a lot about it.
But he was able to build Tiamat first and didn't really feel the pinch of going for an aggressive item against Mundo, who was just not able to push him out. He is ahead by 30 CS because even though Mundo respects how strong Kubon is, in a sustained engagement he'd probably win. So Kubon doesn't want to go straight and fight him, therefore he's just walked through his jungle and taken over his camps.
Dragon is coming up in 20 seconds, so that's going to be where we'll see our next team fight. MYM are the first to the pit here, as they will secure a lot of the area and de-ward it. You can see 3 sweepers out on the side of NIP, 2 on the side of MYM. So, you know, they're clearing out as much vision as they can and trying to set up for this dragon, but MYM are maybe looking for a fight here.
NIP are slightly split, specifically Ammon, who is in the middle of no man's land. That's going to be the ward dying and the aggression onto Dragon, down to half HP already. I'm not sure Ammon can even get in range. He lands the Q, he follows up, doesn't quite get the steal, jumps back to Zoro. Livik gets completely chunked at the start of this fight. Zoro was already doing work. Kubon is already in the back lines and gets instantly dropped. Makler gets knocked away. Ammon doesn't follow up onto that, but Chuyu has got an angry Mundo on him, and there's no way he can fight him in a head-on trade, and there's no way he can get away from those cleavers. 4 for 1. Yes, they pick up the dragon, but at what cost? That's actually 3 for 1.
3 for 1 overall. They not only got the 3 kills in that engagement. Mundo took down the top tower before teleporting in and managed to get there just in time for the fight to start. There was no damage down on Nuke Duck before the fight, and he actually managed to come in through the bottom side of the Dragon Pit. Ended up landing massive amounts of damage during that team fight, picked up a kill from himself, and Kubon came, and Zoro Zero comes into the fight, picks up multiple kills there on to Dr. Mundo, and just did so much work there. Picks up the turret, picks up the kills, and they get another turret in the mid. That was huge for NIP.
Because Ninjas and the Pyjamas came so far ahead in that trade, they had all their pushing champions still alive. So they just said, okay, we'll go mid lane and we'll go bot lane. We'll pick up 2 turrets. Kale's exceptional pushing turrets. So is Freeze when no one else is around. And Pow Pow will just make quick work of that mid lane turret, which is already fallen. Even has the extra armor, or I guess the super darn shield as it's being called, on the mid and top turrets.
It was 3 turrets overall there to finish that. Lichbane has just been picked up by Kale, but even with the Sheen as well, that's just added damage onto Kale's ability to push. Managed to get the bottom inner, and it's just snowballing a little bit away from MYM right now. It's by no means heavily in favor of NIP. The goal difference is only nearly 3,000. But that was a big power play out of NIP. MYM felt they had the pace of this game under control, and NIP just showed them that MYM still have to be careful. They can't just rush down a dragon like that without thinking about the consequences.
So all in all, between these lanes, the farm is very similar. The Blade of the Ruin King has been finished by Lucian. We'll see exactly how well that does in the upcoming team fights. We're going to see, well, this is the first time we actually see him using that, but Amin definitely clearing out that plant and doesn't manage to take the camp, but gets 5 gold.
MYM are going with a little bit of a unique itemization here. Elise has picked up an Abyssal Scepter as a second item. Typically, you'll see Elise go full tank in the jungle, maybe even picking up a Haunting Guise is one of the other options. Yeah. The ability to have that extra percentage damage. She's going to reduce the magic resist of their opponents, which I think is obviously going to help Elise, Zyra, and Gragas. It's just not typical.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense in this game in particular because you've got the Kale damage, you've got Mundo throwing in the Burning Agony, also Miffy is going to do more damage than the usual support. But yeah, I agree, usually you go for like the Haunting Guys, and this could be the collapse onto MYM. Well, NIP just kind of in their jungle, and if they want to retreat, they're going to have to go through Ninjas in Pyjamas. Just hanging around the mid lane. Mundo is quite happy to be by himself. He can tank up the enemy team for a little while before his team react, and he's actually just sitting under the turret. And there goes the tip as the Stranglethorns comes out for the disengage, knocks up Miffy. Surely gonna die. There's the intervention coming out. Makala is already on the front lines. Zoro Zero is zoning at everyone else by himself. Zap comes across, Nuke flashes for his Reckoning into that auto attack, picks up that kill.
That was a big fight. Zoro Zero is still very tanky. It's still going on.
Back in. Amin jumps onto the turret. There's the insect backwards. Doesn't even die for his troubles. That's a 1 for 3 so far. Zoro Zero will carry on diving turrets as long as he's got damage behind him. Kubon is the next to fall. This could be the ace. In fact, it will be. Makla drops for the ace, and that's the triple kill for Freeze.
Amazing fight out of NIP. They only lost Miffy for an entire ace, and NIP now have the options available. It looks like they're going to leave Freeze in the middle lane. No, it's going to be Nuke to push down that tower. And that was just amazing tanking by Zoro Zero. He knew his limitations, just pretty much baited in MYM by being just a brick wall in front of him. They burst quite a lot for him, then changed to Miffy, who got intervention. So after all of the cooldowns were used out of MYM, NIP re-engage, and then re-engage a second time to finish off the final members of MYM.
You said Zoro Zero knows his limitations, but I think what's more accurate is he has no limitation, which allowed him to just dive that inhibitor turret. Kubon has disconnected. Actually, that's going to be the GG. They have surrendered, and we will be jumping back to the studio.
Yeah, we will be back in just a second. We are just going to admire the victory screen here for a second as we look at the 4-0 and 5 end for Mundo. And what a game that was for our first game of the best of 3 here for the FACEIT Challenger Invitational. I mean, MYM felt they had the pacing for that game and then overstepped at Dragon.
Yeah, you wouldn't expect anything less from these two teams either. NIP and MYM, ex-LCS teams, and we definitely saw exactly what these two teams are capable of.
Yeah, and that was just as I said, MYM felt they had control, felt they had the pacing of the game, and they certainly did on the first Dragon, and thought, okay, well, it worked once, let's go for it again. And NIP punished them, and then as soon as they picked up those first sets of objectives, those towers, it just gave them so much gold that that itemization was way better for that point in the game. I feel MYM were itemizing a little bit for the later game, and it just didn't get there for them.
Because the pacing of the game was so slow at the start, I felt like MYM just felt the rest of the game was going to be like that until like 50 minutes, and therefore started itemizing towards that. The Abyssal Scepter was picked up as well, which is not all that common. Yes, it's more damage in the later game, and if you can itemize it early, great. But they got too comfortable in that game, and then before they knew it, 0-0 was way too far ahead. He was like farming 40 minions past where he usually should be, and then he just walked into their team, and there was nothing they could do about it.
Speaking of getting comfortable, make yourselves comfortable, because we'll be back in a couple of minutes here with game number 2 of our first semi-finals. It'll be NIP versus MYM, game 2 for the FACEIT Challenger Invitational when we return.